Hey everyone, Dr. Lee Bryce here with your week 3 Intro to SOC video. All right, let's get started. This week, we're covering chapters 5 and 6, consuming social order, and then race, merit, and group boundaries. All right, I forgot to put my phone on Do Not Disturb, so I'm going to do that. All right, so our agenda, we're going to do a little bit of review, then I'll cover chapters 5 and 6. I'm actually also going to discuss how to write a paper a little bit and show you some additional resources that I've added to our Blackboard page. I'm also going to show you where the midterm study guide is located because I want you to start preparing for that. Our midterm is coming up fast next week, and then week 4, and then your exit pass and your reminders. Okay, so I'm choosing to do the review this week on chapter 2 because your breaking a norm activity in paper is due this week, and the foundation for that assignment is really rooted in chapter 2 of our textbook on norms. So just as a reminder, culture is systems and patterns of meaning shared by members of a group. You can have material or non-material culture. So material culture being physical things within our society that make up our culture, our food, our clothing, that sort of thing. And then non-material culture are non-objects. So language was the example I gave last week when we started chapter 2. Norms are often informal but widely known and accepted ways of doing things within a culture. So these are sort of taken for granted things that everyone just assumes people within a society will know are normal. Of course, if you break norms, you're engaging in deviant behavior, so going against norms. And if you go against norms and you engage in deviant behavior, there's going to be some sort of social sanction. So maybe it's stink eye if you're not breaking a very serious norm. Maybe you'll be disowned by family and friends if you break a more serious norm. And then, of course, there can be legal repercussions if you're breaking really serious norms, right? Most societies have some sort of legal system. Values are individual or group beliefs about what is right and wrong, important or unimportant, and desirable and undesirable within any given society. Ethnocentrism is using one's own culture to understand and evaluate others. Often, this with ethnocentrism, it includes the belief that one's culture is superior or better than others. Now, I brought up some other terms last week related to American exceptionalism and some other things. We're going to go into greater detail about some of those topics when we start getting into chapters 5 and 6 this week. But first, since we just went over chapter 2 content and you have your breaking a norm activity in paper, I also want to talk about how do we write a college level paper. I was going through your introductory discussion board post the other day, and I noticed a lot of you are not first year traditional students. A lot of you have been at Elmhurst for a while now, or you're transfer students from community college. Probably this isn't your first college paper. So if that's the case, maybe skip over this. But maybe it is your first college paper, or you've struggled to get quote unquote good grades on papers in other classes in the past. I want to make sure everyone has the stuff they need to be successful for the paper assignment. And so I'm going to take you to our Blackboard page. I'm going to go into student preview. And then I'm going to go to writing resources, optional, which is at the bottom. Most of these are PDF, so generic guides that can help you with your writing. The only one that's an original document I created myself is this 5-paragraph essay Word doc at the end. So if you want to know what your paper should look like, using APA formatting, which is a really popular style guide in the social sciences. Even in sociology, we do have the American Sociological Association style, but I would argue APA, the psychology style, is actually more common in our field. Anyway, I've digressed. So this shows you what the formatting should look like, what your font, your indentation, all of these organizational, mechanical aspects of your writing a paper should look like. And I like these little blurbs here because they provide an explanation and justification as to why or how to do these things in APA style. And you can go through and see all those blurbs throughout. Now, one thing to know is that this is a more sophisticated upper division style paper. So there are author notes and there's an abstract for a lower level class, especially one that requires specific directions. It's a non-traditional paper, if you will. I'm not going to require those two components, but if you'd like to include those parts of APA style in your breaking a norm paper, you can. It's good practice, especially maybe if you are a junior or a senior and you want to have that practice of formatting everything in APA style to a T. I know to a certain extent using proper APA or ASA formatting seems arbitrary. Like if you're writing a good paper, you have smart things to say, you're thinking critically, all the content in your paper is your own original idea. Why bother with these style guides? Why take off points for not doing APA or ASA style correctly? So I want to sort of provide some transparency with why I do take that into consideration when I grade your paper. I do that because the expectation when you graduate with a bachelor degree in the social sciences is that you will know how to write a paper, a good paper, a smart paper with critical thinking, and you'll be able to format that paper according to various criteria. And that might not be ASA or APA formatting once you graduate and you have your first job, but you will have some sort of formatting style guide that you need to use that your boss will expect you to know how to use. So we're preparing you for that by teaching you these style guides and how to properly format everything. That way, when you're on the job market and you're graduating from Elmhurst, you can say, hey, I know how to write a paper and format it properly. And I can take any sort of formatting style guide you might throw at me when I start my job with you, and I can figure it out. And here is a format for ASA if you would prefer that. Okay, let's see. This is a sample paper. These are for APA. These are style guides going over the details of how to properly format everything for ASA and then APA. Now, these last two, well, really last three, they're more about content and organizing your thoughts in a cohesive way. And then also making sure you have all the necessary components of a college level paper. So here, you can see there's a checklist making sure you have all the content stuff necessary, all the structure stuff that's necessary. You're providing clarity, you're using your style and citations correctly. I find this is helpful because oftentimes students get in the weeds thinking about different requirements for a written assignment, and then they forget some of the sort of obvious parts of writing a paper. Like I can't tell you how many papers I get submitted as final drafts that don't have a student's name. Include the name, include all of those sort of obvious aspects of a formal written college level assignment. And if you tend to forget those sort of obvious things, I myself being someone who forgets obvious things like that, this checklist comes in handy. If sometimes you struggle with your ideas not flowing in a sort of logical way, you're all over the place. You have these really awesome ideas, but you struggle to organize them in a cohesive, logical, narrative sort of way, you can try reverse outlining. So again, I'm not going to cover this in too great a detail. These writing resources are optional, but if that's something you struggle with, I encourage you to download this document and save it on your computer so that even if you don't necessarily need it for our paper, because there is a step-by-step set of directions that will help you organize your thoughts, this can be helpful in the future, just sort of as an FYI, when you're organizing your thoughts for a more traditional writing assignment in the future. And then finally, I have my 5 paragraph essay document that I created myself because I have found increasingly students don't create new paragraphs when they have new ideas. And in fact, I'll have students submit the final draft of their paper sometimes, and they have no paragraphs. It's just one giant blurb. You might be able to tell that's sort of a soapbox pet peeve of mine. So, in order to combat that, I have created this document. When I was in junior high and high school, we used to learn how to write 5 paragraph essays, organizing all of our thoughts around new paragraphs. But that's being taught less and less, especially in public school systems in junior high and high school. So, I provide you with this guide. It tells you should have an intro paragraph, 3 body paragraphs that support 3 different sub themes that you're focusing on. And then you should have a conclusion paragraph. Now, sometimes students will look at this and they'll say, but professor, well, if I only write 5 paragraphs, that won't be long enough to make the word and page length requirements, which are outlined in the assignment rubric in the syllabus, by the way, if you're looking for that. And to that I say, well, you can just expand upon this. So instead of having 3 sub themes and 3 body paragraphs, perhaps you have 4 or 5 sub themes with their own corresponding body paragraph. The main idea, the important thing here is that when you have a new subtopic, when you have a new idea, you're starting a new paragraph. But sometimes that's not enough. Sometimes students will have really, really long paragraphs still. So I also have some information here about how to structure the sentences within each paragraph so that you don't have what I call a run-on paragraph. Okay. And so you can see here, each paragraph, regardless of what type of paragraph it is, should have an intro sentence, a few supporting ideas in the body part of your paragraph, and then a concluding sentence at the end of the paragraph. Essentially, you should have around 5 sentences per paragraph. And in fact, because organizing my writing is something I do struggle with, I'll often count how many sentences I have in a paragraph. And if I start getting to 7 or 8 sentences, that to me is a yellow flag that perhaps it's time to start a new paragraph. Another thing I'll do, speaking of running on, I also look for run on sentences in my writing. And so a rule of thumb that I always use for myself, that I have been told by literature professors is a good rule of thumb, is that if you have a sentence that is longer than 3 rows using 12-point Time New Roman font, double spaced, if you have a sentence that's longer than 3 rows, it probably means that sentence is a run-on, and you should find a way to break it up into 2 sentences. All right, the last thing I'll say about that, a great way to proofread your writing, and it sounds silly, but I promise it works. Once you start having full drafts of your paper, or maybe a full draft of a section of your paper, read it out loud to yourself quietly. If you do that, you're more likely to catch some of those smaller grammatical or spelling mistakes that your brain subconsciously skips over when you're reading in your own brain, quite like not out loud to yourself. So those are some of the tips and tricks I have for how to write a college level paper. I hope it helps. Obviously, it's not required to look over all of those writing resources in depth, but certainly it's helpful. And then at the very end of the Blackboard, our Blackboard site is a link to our library website, and there's additional resources on the library website regarding how to write a college level paper and how to cite things properly. I think while I'm on our Blackboard page, I want to point out that your midterm study guide is here. So let's see what that looks like. This is sort of upcoming attractions, right? You don't have to take your midterm exam until the end of next week, which is week 4. Sorry, this says 101, but it should say 100. Sorry. My intro SOC classes at my other previous institutions was always 101. But you can see you're responsible for the syllabus, chapters 1 through 7 in our textbook, and then all class lectures. So those are the videos I've created as well as the PowerPoints. This is activities, but In online classes, you don't really have activities. The closest thing in an online asynchronous class to activities would be the smaller assignments you have, which are the discussion board posts. So any of those prompts are fair game for the midterm as well. And you can see some of the topics here. And then I literally just go through all the key terms for these chapters 1 through 7. And then all the theory, themes, and methodologies. And again, I've broken them down by chapter 1 through 7. Basically, if you go through this study guide and you type out definitions and terms for all of these words on here, you're probably going to do well on the exam. As a reminder, this is in the syllabus, but the midterm and final exam are true, false, multiple choice, and there might be 1 or 2 short response questions. However, there will not be an essay component to either exam. I don't think that's feasible in a shorter 8-week summer session asynchronous online class. All right. Now let's get into new material for this week. Chapter 5, Consuming Social Order. So here we're building upon what we've sort of already been discussing in terms of capitalism and globalization, and we're talking about consumption. And so your textbook authors start with the evolution of shopping in that sort of historical context, talking about arcades for the more affluent early on in the United States and sort of at the height of consumerism or the beginning height of consumerism, how we evolved into shopping malls, especially in the advent of suburbia, sort of in the post-World War II era. And then more recently, we start seeing fewer and fewer shopping malls, even in the suburbs, and more big box stores. So Target, Walmart, Costco, Sam's Club, all of those. Essentially, in the United States, we really want to be able to get everything we need in one place. So it used to be you go to a shopping mall on the weekends and they would have clothing stores and home appliance stores and department stores, Sears, JCPenney, all that stuff. And nowadays, we're more likely to go to Target to get some groceries, makeup, clothes, whatever it is you might need, right? The textbook authors also do some interesting things where they're sort of comparing the way we used to shop back in the day in the 1800s to what's happening in a more contemporary setting. And so they make a lot of parallels to ordering stuff out of a catalog, like Sears catalog was really popular in the 1800s, especially for those folks living on farms, maybe out west. Let's say they didn't have access to urban centers where they could go to a department store. They'd order what they want from a catalog and then things would get shipped to them. Or well, I guess not shipped. They usually trains would bring everything to them and they would get their goods and services that way. And in fact, you could order an entire home with all of the parts you needed to build that home through Sears catalog. And there are still Sears catalog homes that people live in the United States to this day, especially out west, like in California and places like that. Now, you might not be able to buy a home from Costco or Target nowadays, but if Jeff Bezos has his way, we'll be able to do so on Amazon any day now. But we do, so there's a lot of parallels between that and shopping at Amazon, especially if you think about folks in the United States right now living in more rural areas. They might not have access to they might have to drive 45 minutes an hour to get to Walmart or Target or a grocery store, but they can order what they want on Amazon. So like I have a friend, she's a professor at Mississippi State. It does literally take her 45 minutes to drive to Target and Walmart. But she can order whatever she wants on Amazon. So it's interesting to sort of compare and contrast some of these various shopping trends in the United States that are really rooted in consumerism. Now, your textbook authors use this chapter to talk about rational choice model, applying it to some of the shopping patterns that exist and how people shop and consume in the United States. So, rational choice model is an approach to social action that assumes that actors are rational and behave purposefully to achieve desired goals. And so, again, they apply this to some of the consumer and consumption patterns in our society throughout our country's history. They also build upon some of that stuff on norms and values from chapter 2, talking about how shopping is also motivated by values, and in particular, values linked to individual identity and social belonging. So, part of why we shop the way that we do and we consume that way that we do is because it's a way for us to build an individual identity. And so I used the example of being able to buy makeup at Target. Well, that's helping people construct an identity that's very feminine, um, sort of like a quote unquote girly girl, if you will. And in fact, in more contemporary settings, we see that a lot of non binary folks are getting professional contracts with major makeup companies. But even as that happens, and it might not necessarily be rooted to sex, it's still very genderized, right? It's still very feminized, where wearing makeup is still feminine, even as folks with different genders have greater access to makeup and things that have historically been labeled or coded as for women or for girls or feminine. If you shop and you consume in a particular way, you also gain a sense of social belonging. And so, if you are shopping the way your other women are, and you're shopping the way other middle class women are, then you're probably going to feel a sense of social belonging, or at least that's the goal, to other women with similar identity categories. And so we can start to think about major social patterns with how folks shop based on different aspects of their identity or identities they're trying to achieve. So perhaps you're not middle class, but you're shopping like you're middle class because you want people to think you're middle class. And maybe, you might be putting things on credit, but it's this idea that if you shop the way people with similar identity categories as you shop, then you'll fit in and you'll have that social belonging. Chapter 6 focuses on race, merit, and group boundaries. So, recall last week I talked about essentialism. Your textbook authors define this as belief that all members of a group share innate, unchanging, essential characteristics that make them different from other groups. And so then we get to in groups and out groups. Now, what's interesting about essentialism is it's the belief that these things are unchanging and innate. Because in reality, a lot of things that we think are unchangeable about a person or a group of people, these things are socially constructed and could be changed or altered or understood differently if there were changes to how our society operates. And I'll talk more about that in just a second when we get to social constructionism. But part of this definition of essentialism is this idea that these essential characteristics make us different from other groups. And so that leads to in groups, we, a group or category a person identifies with, versus an out group, they, a group or category a person does not identify with. And so essentialism is really helps to create this divide of us versus them, an in group and an out group. Now, I said essentialism, maybe these things that we think are innate about a particular group are not so concrete. And that's because things are often socially constructed. So, social constructionism is the idea that features of social units are shaped by social processes, varying over time and across contexts. So, within United States, things have evolved with how they are socially constructed over time, or perhaps in different parts of the United States. Like I just spent the last 3 years of my career in the South, and I would argue that how certain social constructs are understood in the South are different than they are in the North, and in particular the Midwest. Even things like I know in Chicago, the Chicagoland area, and in the Midwest, you might call the toilet, a public toilet, the washroom. But in other parts of the country, even in Ohio, where I'm from, which is pretty close to Chicagoland, we would just say bathroom or restroom. Um, when I lived in Hawaii, often public restrooms, the sign would say toilet. So the words that we use, the slang that we use can be socially constructed geographically. And then, of course, different countries, different societies also socially construct things differently. So, with social constructionism, again, features of social units are shaped by social processes and they can vary over time and across contexts. That connects to essentialism again because things that we think are concrete and innate within our society, within individuals and groups of people, can actually change and evolve and be constructed differently over time. Okay, moving right along. In chapter 6, we're really getting at the root of some really important foundational terms within the field of sociology, including race, which is a social category that classifies people according to perceived differences in physical appearance and shared heritage. Now, again, thinking back to essentialism and social constructs, you'll see I highlighted perceived differences. That's because race is actually a social construct. There's no biological, scientific fact in race. We think it's innate, but it's actually a social construct. And in fact, the way that we have defined race in the United States specifically has evolved over time. If you were to look at the census data that the federal government collects every 10 years, and you were to look at how questions about race were asked at the beginning of the census when we first started collecting that data compared to now, there'd be a huge difference in the options folks had. And you could look, 50 years ago and there might be some differences, 100 years ago and there might be some differences. That's because race is socially constructed. Racism is the hierarchical ranking and differential treatment of racialized groups. Now, I think a lot of people have sort of a lay understanding of what racism means. We talk about it a lot, especially on social media. But for our purposes in sociology, I really want to make sure you understand there's sort of two main ways that racism can play out. It can be interpersonal, so sort of more micro level, if you will. Remember the macro, micro, overarching analysis that your textbook authors highlight throughout the book. Can be sort of micro level, interpersonal. These are biases and discriminations people may experience on a day-to-day basis in their everyday lives because of racism. But it's also, racism can be institutionalized. So there are institutionalized inequalities. This is more of a macro understanding of racism, where our social institutions are inherently racist in and of themselves. And so, if you're not familiar with what a social institution is, a social institution is any big, high level social structure that organizes our everyday lives. So, some examples that we usually use in sociology are things like education, so schools, policy and lawmakers and the law structure, religion and religious churches and things like that, various forms of religion. These are all high-level social entities that organize our everyday lives. And so if you think about education is a good example. So it organizes our everyday lives. For you all as Elmhurst students, what time you get up, what time you eat your meals, where you eat your meals. If you live on campus, what type of food you have access to. All of these different aspects of your everyday life are organized around Elmhurst, around education as a social institution. Now, sometimes I'll have students say, well, when I graduate from Elmhurst, I'm never going to go back to school ever again. So how can it be a social institution? It's not going to organize my life. And to that, I would say, well, think about the types of jobs you're going to have access to once you graduate. Your educational attainment is always going to have some sort of influence and impact on your career long term, the amount of money you're able to earn over the duration of your lifetime. And then additionally, sort of in a fun, tongue-in-cheek sort of way, I always ask students, well, what about traffic patterns during you know, elementary school drop off and pick up? Like if you've ever had to live close to an elementary school or a high school, but especially an elementary school, I'll be damned if the traffic patterns of that elementary school are not going to impact the route you take to get to work, or maybe you have to leave 30 minutes earlier to avoid the drop off or pick up traffic. So education does organize our everyday lives, even if you don't necessarily see it on a regular basis because you're not currently a student or you don't work at a school. Now, in terms of institutional racism in education, we can start to think about educational attainment. So we know from the social science literature that students of color are less likely to get called on by teachers in K through 12 schools. We know that students of color are less likely to go to college and then obtain college degrees. And in fact, there are a lot of different resources available for students of color because of that. And so helping students of color navigate higher education so that they will be more successful. Although, you know, we can argue about all of that, especially right now, the Supreme Court of the United States actually, not this summer, but last summer, overturned affirmative action policy for higher education across the country. And so we can start to see some really important contemporary issues unfurling related to institutional racism within higher education. All right. Now, racial discrimination is a little bit different. This is differential treatment of persons, including denial of equal opportunities and rights on the basis of perceived racism. So you're actually treating people differently and denying people equity within social institutions, within lots of different things. Okay. That's sort of all I have for you in terms of lecture and content. As always, here's your exit pass. And then as reminders, read chapter 5 and 6, complete your breaking and norm activity in paper. And remember, you will have a chance to rewrite your paper if you get your feedback from me and you're dissatisfied with the grade, you think there's a lot you need to work on, you need to make these edits. You will have about a week where you can make those changes as needed. Sometimes students don't need to. And I'll go into greater detail about that once everyone submitted their paper and I've sort of seen the work and all of that. And then, of course, start thinking about your study habits and preparing for the midterm exam. Other than that, that's all I have for you. I look forward to another awesome week coming up. Bye, everyone.